Among other things, the goal of your message is to provide clarity, reinforce values, deconstruct false paradigms. Here's what we mean by that many people come into this space with a certain set of expectations and a certain paradigm, and much of our messaging is intended to deconstruct the false paradigms that they have. Classic example, when most people in our churches think about foster care and adoption, the primary lens through which they filter that is what? Bring a child into your home. And so much of our messaging has to deconstruct that narrow and false paradigm that it's all about bringing a child into your home. Because what we know in this room is that that is a significant piece of it, but it is certainly not the whole of it. And so our messaging deconstructs some of those false paradigms, and it articulates our why. Why are we doing this? So much of our language is spent on the what and the how. What is it that we're supposed to do, and how are we supposed to do it? But at the end of the day, people are primarily motivated by a why. And when they really begin to embrace a deep sense of why, the what and the how begin to take care of itself to a certain degree. So we're going to start talking about why, and then we'll get to a lot of the what and the how. And here's our driving why. We are not simply recruiting people to meet a need. We are discipling people to obey a command. Our fundamental effort in this space is not first recruitment. But in our environment, in the church environment, our primary driving factor is not recruitment, it's discipleship. Perhaps we have a foster care crisis in our cities because we have a discipleship crisis in our churches. And so what would it look like for us to begin from a place of discipleship, infusing people with a deep sense of why, and then motivating them with the what and the how to engage in places that they might not otherwise have engaged in? That recruiting can only go so far. But discipleship takes people incredibly far, further than they would have ever gone on their own. Jesus himself says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, therefore go and recruit more people. No. Therefore go and make disciples and do what? Teach them to obey. Teach them to obey. So fundamentally, the root from which we start is discipleship. That's a hard thing to remember, especially in the face of urgency, because we all see the urgency. The need is overwhelming. And there's this urgent need for more families, more people engaged. And so very quickly, it's easy for us to fall into the recruitment trap. We need to recruit more families faster. Yes, but what we really need to do is disciple the right families longer. Because when we do that, everybody wins. The families win, the children win, their families win, the system wins, our church wins, our agency wins, everybody wins. Let's look at two central areas of theology. Number one, our adoption. And number two, which is a unique one in this space, is his incarnation. Here's why this is important, and we'll look at this. So much of our church language is spent around the idea that we have been adopted into the family of God. And that is true and beautiful and wonderful. But there's this really interesting kind of tripping thing that happens in our messaging when it's all about our adoption into the family of God, because it begins to sound something like this. Hey, church, we've all been adopted by Jesus into the family of God. Therefore, but wait, we're not all called to adopt. You don't have to adopt. But we're all adopted, but you don't have to adopt. And I think sometimes people kind of go, well, I don't get it then. Like, what are you trying to tell me I'm supposed to do then? So that can't be just the whole of our message. It's a significant part of it, but it's not the whole. So we see the theme of our adoption all throughout Scripture. Ephesians 1, he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. He predestined us for adoption to sonship, that we've been adopted into the family of God. I'll let Aaron explain the predestination part at the break, if that's okay with you. So we're just going to skip on right by that. Aaron's got that one for you, but I'm just going to take the adoption one. That's the easy one, right? Romans chapter 8 says it again. The Spirit you received brought about your adoption to sonship. So we all know these verses. This is our adoption into the family of God, but there's something very unique about not just our adoption, but his incarnation. His incarnation, the incarnation of God, in a sense that says he saw us where we were and he stepped into our story. He incarnated himself. The best way I know how to make sense of incarnation, my seminary professors are rolling over in their grave every time I use this illustration. But it's chili con carne. It's Tex-Mex, right? I'm a Texas boy. It's chili with meat, con carne. It's God con carne, incarnation. It's God with meat on, okay? You'll never eat chili con carne the same. Next time you're at the restaurant, you're taking a bite with your chip, and you're going to say, you know what this reminds me of? And your friends are going to just be super impressed, right? It's God with meat on. And so here's what his incarnation says to us. His incarnation says a lot of things, but it says that God's the kind of God that says, I see you where you are, and I'm coming after you. I see you in your brokenness. I'm stepping into your brokenness. I'm wrapping myself up in your brokenness, literally. Wrapping myself up in your meat, in your flesh. I'm carrying your brokenness to the cross. I'm being broken by your brokenness so that you don't have to be broken anymore. That's the gospel. That's not just the gospel of our adoption, but it's first the gospel of his incarnation. That God is the kind of God that sees hard places and broken people and moves towards him. So passages like Matthew 1, the virgin shall conceive, give birth to a son. They will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. He is with us here. You know what? Every Christmas, God gives us, he sets this softball up on the tee, and he says, I want you to just kill it out of the park. And I'm convinced that one of the absolute most beautiful and powerful messages that we can preach at Christmas is God's heart for the vulnerable and the marginalized. Because that's what Christmas is. That God says, I see you in your brokenness. I'm stepping out of my glory into your mess. And everything is going to change now. John 1:14, Word became flesh, he made his dwelling, or he tabernacled among us. And now Paul in Galatians puts these two ideas together. When he says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, that's incarnation, born under the law, condemned to die is what that means, to redeem those who are under the law, condemned to die, so that we might receive adoption. At just the right time, Jesus stepped into our story, invited us into his family, and everything changed as a result of that. This is the interplay between our adoption, but also his incarnation. The theology of him stepping into our story, taking our place, inviting us into his family, and rewriting everything now. And so here's the message to our people, to our church, that God sees hard places and broken people, and he moves towards them, not away from them. How great is that? That's Christmas. That's all the time, but that's Christmas. God sees hard places and broken people and moves towards them, not away from them. The implications of that are clear. The applications of that are unbelievably broad. Now it's not just foster care and adoption. Now it's reframing my posture towards hard places and broken people and completely flipping the script on what the narrative of the world says I should do. Because the narrative of the world that quite frankly, most people in our circles are operating according to, knowingly or unknowingly, says something very different than what the gospel says. It says that when you see hard places and broken people, you should step away, avoid, isolate, insulate. Do everything that you possibly can to set up a life around yourself where you can pretend like hard places and broken people don't exist. And then the gospel begins to flip the script and says, you know what? What we celebrate about God is that he sees hard and broken and moves towards them. And so the implications of that are clear and the applications are broad. Not just foster care and adoption, but the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, or just the hurting person across the street. That we now become the kind of people that see hard places and broken people and move towards them, not away from them. So James 1:27, we got to get this right too. So this is seminary where you just dissect and pick things apart because it's fun, right? But this is James 1:27 in its purest sense. Religion is not our word religion. Religion in this context, the true meaning of that word means an outward display of something that's inwardly true. That's what we're talking about. An outward display of the gospel, which is inwardly true in our people as we continue to disciple them in it. An outward display of the gospel that's inwardly true in us, that is pure and undefiled before God the Father, is to visit or to move, step towards, get involved with orphans and widows. Now, I'm convinced orphans and widows is not prescriptive in this verse. I think it's descriptive in this verse. It's representative. See, this verse is not a command, oddly enough. This verse is not, there's no command language in this verse. The tone of this verse is not command, it's description. It's describing what one of the most pure and undefiled reflections of the gospel looks like and how that comes about. And it's essentially saying that that comes about when we see, move, step towards, get involved with the most vulnerable in our society. So if you went to James and said, James, you didn't mention homeless people, you didn't mention victims of sex trafficking, you didn't mention the incarcerated, I don't think James would say, I don't care about them at all. It's orphans and widows or die, right? Of course not. I think James is using orphans and widows as representatives in his culture of those that were the most marginalized and vulnerable in his context. And what he's describing for us and our people is not so much a command, but what it looks like to put the gospel on display in its purest form. That we would be the kind of people that see hard places and broken people and move towards them and not away from them. Because when we do that, it puts the gospel on display with a purity and an undefiledness and a vividness and a clarity, quite frankly, unlike anything else that I'm aware of. The last note is that word "and" there in the original language is not there, actually. So we've added that in the English, but it corrupts the meaning of the passage. So if you remove that in its purest form, here's what it says. One of the purest and most undefiled demonstrations of the gospel is when we move towards hard and broken places because it keeps us unstained from the world. When we do that, it keeps us unstained from the world. Not "and keep yourself," but when we do that, when we move towards the afflicted, it keeps us unstained from the world. How's that? Because it's impossible to hold the narrative of the world, which says avoid, isolate, insulate, and the narrative of the gospel, which says move towards, engage, step into. It's impossible to hold both of those in tandem. One of them's got to give. And when we step into hard places, it keeps us unstained from this narrative. That we would be the kind of people that are stained by the brokenness of others, not by the narrative of this world. This is James 1:27. We've got to get that right. We've got to get that right for our people. We have to have a clarity of messaging for our people. That we are the kind of people that see hard places and broken people and move towards them, not away from them. How cool would it be if you or someone at your church or in your ministry stood up and laid that blanket out across your congregation? This is an identity-informed message. It's not a recruitment-informed message. It's not a manipulative. It's not a let's try to play on people to get them involved. This is identity. Who are we? Well, we are the kind of people that do this. That's who we are, and that's who we're going to be. And that's going to become the filter and the grid through which we make decisions as we move forward. So 3 things the gospel does for our people. It compels them into it. It becomes the primary motivating factor. So we're not recruiting people with a need. We are discipling people with a command, with the gospel. Here's what happens, the difference between the two. If you recruit people with a need, you tell them there's a really overwhelming need and we need you to respond. And most people in that moment will say, sign me up. Give me the bulletin. I'll sign my name. You can email me. I will help meet that need. And then here's what happens. When they feel like that need has been met, they're done. Or when they feel like that need is too overwhelming, they're done. Somebody else can meet this need. So we don't recruit from a needs-based place. We recruit from a gospel-motivated place. Why? Because when the need, number one, when we are motivated by the gospel, the needs are never over. Because we're always the kind of people that are moving towards hard places. And number two, when the need gets overwhelming, the gospel ultimately is what sustains us. It reminds us that this work is worth it. The community of people around me reminding me of the gospel are helping to sustain me and hold me up, even when the need is hard. So it sustains us in the midst of it, and then it tells a story through it in a very pure and undefiled and vivid way. That we become the kind of people that see hard places and broken people and move towards them, not away from them. So there's a difference between our messaging. One message is conditional, and one is vision-driven. A conditional message says this to our church: if God is calling you, or if God is stirring your heart, or if you feel led. But a vision-driven message doesn't start with if, it starts with because. Because God has, this is who we're going to be, and this is what we're going to do. Because you know just as well as I do that if we start with if with our people, they are really good at finding the loopholes, right? They will find those conditions quickly and hold them up and explain to you all the reasons why that if does not apply to them. But a vision-driven message says that no. Because of what God has done, this is what we're going to do and who we're going to be. So a solid theological foundation helps people rehearse how they will respond in the moment and gives them the courage they need to do so. Here's what I mean by that. We're helping our people preemptively rehearse how they are going to respond in the moment. Okay? What does that mean? It means, for my daughters, for example, one of them, I'm sure, despite my impeccable fathering, will end up at a party they shouldn't be at in high school, right? So I've decided I probably can't avoid that with all these girls that live in my house. So it's probably going to eventually happen, but what I can do is preemptively help them prepare for how they are going to respond when they are in a position like that. When someone comes up and says, "Do you want a drink?" I don't want them having to figure out how they're going to respond right there on the fly in that moment. I want to have done the tilling on the front end to preemptively help them rehearse how they're going to respond so they're not caught off guard. One of the best things we can do for our people as we press the gospel deeply into them is then begin to help them rehearse how they're going to respond when hard places and broken people are really hard and broken, so that they're not having to figure it out on the fly. That we are constantly reinforcing the idea that the gospel sets this framework and this structure which reminds us it's worth it, that hard things are worth it. We do it because it's hard. That people come and say, "Gosh, it's just so hard." Absolutely, that's why we do it. That's not like the reason we shouldn't do it, that's the reason why we should. So we're helping people preemptively rehearse how they're going to respond in the moment. And we're brokering courage for them is what we're doing. We're offering courage to them, and we're helping them reinforce that. Let's take 3 minutes, and great question, Aaron. And so here's what I want us to do. As we talk about everyone can do something, creating space for everyone to engage in your ministry, is how do we help people move back from that narrow point of the cone where they're feeling like you're trying to box me in and squeeze me on this, and we go, no, we want you to take a step back and see the bigger picture and begin to explore the unique creativity that God has given you and the unique places God has offered you to apply this. Because the implications are clear, the applications are endless. And so there's another ebook called Everyone Can Do Something, and you can find it on the website as well. Here's the main idea. We're not all called to do the same thing, but we're all capable of doing something. This is the theology of the body of Christ. We won't read through it all. 1 Corinthians 12 talks about ears, eyes, hands, feet. Romans 12 says that we've all been given a unique gift for unique manifestation of grace, so let us use them. So each of us have unique gifts. We have unique passions and talents and callings and quirks and spaces that God has placed us in. And so our message to our church is not, let's move you to that most narrow, boxed-in place that we possibly can, but instead, let's cause you to step back and to look around and think about, wow, all this broad, wide-open space that God has given me to be creative and to apply the uniqueness of the gifts that He's given me. Here's what it could look like. I think it's helpful to show people visually in your church. So an example could be a family brings children into their home, and the people in their small group wrap around them. And these are critical places with prayer or cleaning or groceries or supplies or babysitting or money. That we're empowering these unique roles. That we're showing people we're not all called to do the same thing, but we're all capable of doing something, and there's no insignificant parts in the body of Christ. So no foster family that brings a new placement into their home opens the door to a casserole and says, "Thank you very much for the casserole. Now, before you leave, we need to be very clear about something. What we are doing by bringing this kid into our home is far more important than what you are doing by bringing us a lasagna." We would never say that. Instead, the foster family says, "My God, thank you. We can't do what we do without you, so thank you so much." There are no insignificant parts. Part of it is empowering our people with that truth. Because they feel, again, if it's not this tip of the spear, which in their mind is, adopting every orphan in Africa or fostering 100 kids or whatever, right? If I'm not doing that, then I'm not really doing anything. And so what we want to do is empower our people with, no, we all celebrate the same gospel, but we all don't demonstrate that gospel in the same way. And God's given us each uniquenesses and diversities and giftings of how we can apply that in our own spheres, and there's no insignificant parts. So the script at our church could be, at so-and-so church, some of us are going to bring children into our homes. The rest of us are going to find ways to serve and support them as best as we can. We talk about on-ramping. So let's support that message. Going back to your question, if we're going to present a message and a call to people, how are we going to reinforce that messaging with a structure that helps them follow through? So we can think of it in terms of tiers. Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. Tier 1 commitment, you can think of it like low-hanging fruit. So easy, it's almost impossible not to do, right? Like, so easy. A monkey could do it if we showed him how to, right? Super easy. These are things that are incredibly important, but they're super easy on-ramps for people. Bring a meal. Well, I can't really cook. Order a gift card online, email it to them. You never have to get off your couch. So easy, it's harder to actually not do it. Super low-hanging fruit. That we speak to that tier 1 guy in our church. If we're going to talk about this in our church, when I'm at churches, the guy that I talk to in the room, the Joe Smith that I talk to in the room is the guy that showed up at church that morning, probably his first time in a few weeks. His wife convinced him to come. He shows up, doesn't really want to be there, hears that this morning is about foster care and adoption, and immediately checks out. This doesn't apply to me. I have nothing to do with this. I want that guy to walk out thinking, well, maybe there is something I can do. So we're speaking to that. In many cases, one of our audience is that lowest common denominator. So easy, it's almost harder not to do it. Tier 2 are things like babysitting, maybe financial support. You can fill in your own gaps here, but these are a little more involved, but don't require a whole lot of extensive time and training, but they're kind of a next step. And then Tier 3, highest commitment, I would classify, and you could do something different, anything that requires a lot of training. Foster care, adoption, safe families, providing respite, anything that requires kind of extensive ongoing training is Tier 3. Now, what we're clear about is that Tier 3 isn't more important than Tier 1. These are all of equal importance. They're just different on-ramps to meet people where they are. If all that we offer in our church is Tier 1, I'm convinced we have people ready for Tier 3, but all that you're telling them is that they can bring a meal, and they're hungry for more, and they need to be called to hard things. If all we're offering is Tier 3, we're missing out on that Joe Smith guy who walks in and says, there's not a space for me, and our message affirms that for him. You're right, there's not. So our messaging is communicating to different contexts, to different tiers. Another important component about our messaging is the stories that we share, that we're sharing a diversity of stories. This represents a lot of people in your church, people that are still considering. They've done nothing. We're still thinking about it. We're actually still arguing with God about it. You don't know about it because it's this private argument going on in our heart. We haven't made it public yet, but that's where we are. Some people bringing supplies, tangible support, fostering, adopting. Here's the thing, is that if our message is everyone can do something, there are no insignificant parts, they're all equally important, but the only stories we're sharing in our church are of families that bring kids into our home, then our message is a little conflicting. But it's also loud and clear. Everyone can do something, but what we really, really celebrate is the families that bring children into their home. And so we shoot videos, and they're frolicking through the wheat field at sunset, and everyone cried, and now it's happy. And those are beautiful stories that we should share. Let's also share stories that reinforce the everyone can do something message. Let's share stories of the college kid that obviously can't bring a kid into their home, but they've become babysitters for foster families in their church. Let's share stories of the family that's still considering. I would love to go to a church one day, and they show a story on Orphan Sunday of a family that's done nothing. And how cool would that be? And here's their story. They're sitting on a couch, husband and wife, and for 3 minutes, they're talking about, God's kind of put this on our heart, and they've got let's say they've got a bunch of young kids running around, and their house is a mess, and everything's crazy, and they're going, here's the things that we're processing through, Our kids are young, and life's crazy, and, we're still wrestling with God on this and talking with each other about this. And that's it, right? Why? Because that story resonates with the vast majority of people in your church. And they go, wow, us too. Yeah. And then what you can do after that? You can say, hey, if that's you, we're going to have a luncheon next Sunday after church where you can come and it's a safe place for you to start processing this private thing that's been within you in a more public way, in a safe place. How cool would that be? So let's celebrate stories. I tell a story of a guy I met in Kansas City who owns a barbecue restaurant in Kansas City and is at a large church with a lot of foster families. And he's told the church, anytime there's a foster parent function, which is once a month, or a new family brings a child into their home, our restaurant is going to cater the food for free. We're going to make sure they've got it. So he came up to me after this event and said, we're in our late 60s, we're not in a position to bring kids into our home, but I own the best barbecue restaurant in Kansas City. I know what I can do, and I can do it really, really well. And I know what I can't do, and I don't feel bad about that. And that's okay. And I said, fantastic, that's awesome. Let's share the barbecue guy story to our church. We have a mechanic in our church that one Saturday a month on his marquee outside of his shop, he puts a sign up that says free oil changes for single moms and foster parents. Here's a guy I'm Joe Smith, blue collar mechanic. What can I do? Oh my gosh. How cool is that? That you're using what God's giving you as a conduit and an avenue, and you're being creative. That's awesome. So let's share those stories. Let's share the diversity of stories. And when we do that, we're going to talk about this idea a couple times throughout the day. We begin to move from the special mentality into the normal mentality. See, our objective in our church, the goal is not to be a peripheral ministry only a few are involved in, but to build a foundational culture everyone has a role to play in. And so in kind of a counterintuitive way, we want to work really hard to make sure this isn't a special thing in our church. It's actually easy to make this a special thing in our church. And here's what I mean by that. It's a special thing that special people do. So barbecue guy, you're out because you're just, what are you? Mechanic, you're out. College kid, out. Family that's done nothing, out. It's only for special people, and it's a special thing that they do, and we recognize it at special times of the year. Like maybe once or twice. So our church really, really cares about it at special times of the year. So it's really easy for us to kind of unknowingly create this special mentality. We've got to fight really hard to normalize it. And here's what that means. It means that this is a normal thing in our church that normal people in our church do. Here's a mechanic with a marquee. Here's a barbecue guy. Here's a college kid. Here's a young family that's processing through the implication. We don't know yet, right? And you introduce them to the church, and the church says, I know that's Joe and Sue. I know Joe and Sue. They're super normal. They're just like, they're normal. And so are you. And if they can do it, you can be creative too. So the goal isn't to create a peripheral ministry. That happens naturally in our churches. We naturally, unintentionally begin to silo some things. So we actually have to fight real hard to build a foundational culture in which that's not happening. Okay. Quick thoughts on that, questions on that before we transition. Told you, fire hydrant. We're going to have a lot of discussion. Question. So we're going to walk real quickly through about 3 principles, and then we're going to hear from Olive Crest for a couple minutes. We'll take a short coffee break, restroom break. Olive Crest will get us going again for a few minutes, and then we're going to jump into some new stuff before lunch. Sound good? All right. So 3 essential ingredients of movement. How do we begin to create movement in our ministry? If you were with us last year, some of this might be repeats, and if you've heard the Chick-fil-A illustration, you're about to hear it again. So, number 1, how do we create movement for our people? We shrink the problem. This is our advocacy. We shrink the problem. So much of our advocacy is this. There is a really, really, really big problem out there, and it's really, 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 really hard. And it's really, really, really overwhelming. You should get involved. Yeah, we're just a little busy. Our kids aren't the right age. We just don't have the margin and all. These are the things we hear, right? And maybe some of it's their fault because they don't have a framework from which they can think through this correctly. But maybe also some of it's our fault because the advocacy of the messaging of our advocacy creates an environment that's very, very easy for people to say, yeah, doesn't sound too great for me. So, number one, we shrink the problem. We don't minimize the problem. We don't pretend like the problem isn't what it really is, but we shrink it down in a way that's relatable and tangible for them. Here's how it makes most sense to me. We live at this place. We are here way too much, right? There's a lot in our city. There's one right by our house, and it's just too convenient on the way to soccer practice every night, right? So here's the deal with Chick-fil-A, is that there's something very spiritual and holy about it. It's God's chicken. They're Christians. It tastes good. It's like all the perfect ingredients, not just in the sandwich. Like they're Christian. They don't work on Sunday. It's a family-friendly place. They're nice, right? And it's good. So here's the funny thing is my friend just became an operator a couple years ago, and I got to go to his ceremony, his induction ceremony, which was very, very cool. Corporate flies in. One of the guys from corporate basically preached a sermon about how their company exists to honor God and glorify God with what they're doing. It's like, man, this is legit. And the guy said, and I'll never forget it, he said, like every company says, we don't sell chicken sandwiches, we sell an experience, right? Every company said, we don't sell Xerox machines, we sell a copy experience, right? That's what we do. So it's not about product, it's about passion. But that's what he said. He said, we don't sell sandwiches, we sell experiences. He said, but our sandwich is the best, it's the number one. Most of our annual revenue, something like 70% of their annual revenue, he said, comes from the number one value meal, the classic sandwich, fries, and drink. They make more money off of this meal than any of their other things that they offer. The irony is that this is one of the most unhealthy things on the whole menu. So this is almost 1,200 calories, okay? And if you're a calorie person, that's a lot. Like that's probably too much for one meal. But it tastes too good. So I'm sitting there thinking, I totally tuned him out after this because here's what strikes me as interesting about humanity, and I do it myself. We all do it. Our personal sense of satisfaction often trumps good data. So we're really good at saying, I know the data, I understand, but I choose my personal sense of satisfaction, okay? We do that in all arenas of life. I know I shouldn't stay up till 3 a.m. binge watching This Is Us, getting caught up. I know that, but I choose to do it anyway because it's going to make me feel good in a really sad kind of way, right? So that's what we do. We do it in all spheres of life, okay? We do it when we eat. I know it's really unhealthy, but man, it just tastes so good, okay? 1,200 calories. So we discard the data for the sake of our own personal satisfaction. Now, if you came to me and said, Jason, I need to lose 15 pounds, I'd say, great, let's start with what you're eating. What do you eat? Well, I eat the number one value meal at Chick-fil-A for lunch and dinner every day. Say, well, that's a little much. Let's start there, right? Stop eating that, it's 1,200 calories. And you would say, yeah, but I know that, but here's my deal. What's really a calorie? Like, tell me. Somebody explain to me what a calorie is. My 10-year-old daughter asked me the other day, Daddy, what's a calorie? Nothing. I have no idea, right? They're these invisible little evil things that we're told are out there and that we shouldn't have too much of and that we should avoid, but nobody has ever really held one or touched one or seen one or had an experience with one. And so therefore, it's much easier to discard that data. I know it's a lot of calories, but I have no framework for how to understand even what a calorie is. So I discard that data for the sake of my own personal satisfaction. And it makes Chick-fil-A billions of dollars. So if I came to you and said, all right, let's scale it down. Let's shrink down the problem. 4 Snickers bars is roughly the equivalent to, on a calorie level, to the number one value meal at Chick-fil-A. So now I say, look, man, I get what you're saying. I understand. But here's the deal. It's like eating 4 Snickers bars at lunch. And you go, oh, man, that's probably not good. No, it's not good at all. You're super gross if you eat 4 Snickers bars at lunch. That's just like everyone understands that. There's no explanation needed, okay? On a calorie level, it's the same, but here's what we've done. We've gone from 1,200 invisible things that no one can really relate to 4 things that everyone understands what it feels like to hold a candy bar. Everyone's had one. It's much more relatable, it's much more tangible, and therefore much, much, much more difficult to discard. I can't ignore 4. I can ignore 1,200 invisible things. I can't ignore 4 things in my hand. We are shrinking the problem for our people. Shrinking the problem is essentially the art of scaling your vision from a big and complex thing to an easier to grasp and engage thing. So our advocacy and our messaging has to shrink the problem for our people. It's important that they know the data, but the data is not ultimately going to be what drives them. Telling them there's 153 million or 141 million or 120-something million orphans in the world, number one, the fact that we actually don't all use the same number makes people feel like, do they really even know what they're talking about? Or are they just making it up to kind of manipulate me? But that doesn't do much for people. Actually, it's counterproductive. There's 153 million orphans in the world, church. You should do something about it. Wow. That is overwhelming. And here's the deal. I've never actually seen one. I've never had an experience with one. I literally don't know the name of one orphan. I know they're out there. Everybody keeps telling me, but I have no context, no sense of engagement for them. I have no personal relationship with them. So it's so much easier to discard that for the sake of my own personal satisfaction. And that's what our people do. If our advocacy and our messaging is too big and complex. Did you know there's hundreds of thousands of kids in the foster care system? That's good to know, but that's not going to drive people. So what if our messaging was focused on increasing clarity for them? Because when we increase clarity, we decrease anxiety. 153 million orphans in the world doesn't increase clarity. It makes things more complex. Thousands and thousands of kids in our state is important for them to know, but it doesn't increase clarity, it increases complexity. And it increases anxiety and uncertainty for how I can even begin to address that problem. And therefore produces apathy. Man, I know I should care, but I just don't know how, and so I just am not going to. Somebody else can. I will discard that for the sake of my own personal satisfaction. One of my favorite books that I believe everybody in ministry should read, not a Christian book. These are Christian guys, but it's not a Christian book. They don't like cuss or anything. I think sometimes we say it's not a Christian movie. Oh, it must be filled with, cuss words. No, it's just not a Christian book, right? You're not going to buy it at Lifeway. But these are Christian guys who actually grew up in a home that fostered. But they're brilliant when they work with organizations. And they say sometimes what looks like resistance is often just a lack of clarity. I love that. Because sometimes we're so quick to accuse people of being resistant when they're not actually resistant, they're just unclear. And so the burden is not on them to not be resistant. The burden is on us to be clear, to help provide clarity for them. So we increase clarity and we decrease anxiety. I'm reminded of this every time I travel. I land, I get the rental car, I type in the address where I need to go, and Siri increases my clarity the entire way. I don't have to worry about getting lost. There's no anxiety about getting lost. There's a little anxiety about driving at midnight in the rain in Seattle with people flying around me. But I'm not going to get lost because Siri's telling me exactly where to go. She increases my clarity, decreases my anxiety. That's our goal and our advocacy for our people. There's this interesting rule of thumb that says this: people are more likely to engage in a longer journey if they see that some of that journey has already been met than they are willing to engage in a shorter journey if they're starting from zero. Let me say that again. People are more likely to do longer and harder things if they see that it's already started than they are willing to do shorter and easier things if they're starting from zero. So here's the idea. Let's say your church or your ministry wants to raise $80,000 and you have zero raised. And so you start, hey church, we want to raise $80,000. We have zero raised. Who's going to be the first? Versus a $100,000 goal. But hey church, we want to raise $100,000 and we already have 20,000 raised. How great is that? The bottom line is both still need 80,000. Research shows, however, that the vast majority of people are going to jump on the $100,000 goal. Why? Because they see there's already momentum. There's already movement in that direction. There seems to be people that are on board. I don't have to be the first. I don't have to be the trailblazer. I can just jump on to what's already happening. Does that make sense? So in our advocacy, Let's think of it this way. Be relatable and realistic and broker hope for people. Broker hope for people. One of the ways we broker hope is and we're relatable and realistic is maybe the vision for your church is no longer, the data is still, there's hundreds of kids in our county, thousands in our state, but for our church, here's our goal. Over the next 12 months, we want 10 new families to either start the foster care licensing process or complete it. 10 new families. And guess what, church? We already have 2, right? How cool would that be? People go, wow, that's awesome. We're already 20% of the way there. People are already on board. Let's do this. So you identify the 2 that were already doing that before you decide to make that vision. Say, can we use you as the 2? And they go, absolutely, if it helps more people, right? Hey, church, our goal is 10. Who's going to be the first? People go, ooh, I don't know, right? Hey, church, our goal is 10. We've already got 2. It's how awesome. It's Joe and Jane, and it's Bill and Sue. Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, all right. We're 20% of the way there. So be relatable, be realistic. Advocacy. Opportunities, going back to our tier 1. Here's our different on-ramps in our church that meet you where you are and take you into new places. And then in terms of ministry, scaling our ministry, shrinking the problem for our people to make it relatable, it also applies to our ministry. Maybe you're just getting started, or maybe you're just kind of at a reboot, or you just need to slow down. And you can focus on just being slow. The goal is not speed, the goal is sustainability. You can be simple. Just do a few things really, really well. You try to do everything, you're going to end up doing nothing. Just do a few things really, really well, and be small. The goal is not size. The goal is significance. There's another ebook on the website, 3 principles, that walk you through that in greater detail. Slow, simple, and small. So we shrink the problem. We make it more relatable. We put it in their hands. On a macro scale for our church ministry, we shrink the problem. In terms of our advocacy. On an individual level, we shrink the problem and say, you know what? The call for you is not to change the world of every kid, but it's simply to consider on what level and in what capacity and through what unique gifting that God's given me, how in a creative way can I change the world of at least one kid? Can I? Absolutely. Absolutely. Everybody can do something. Everybody can change the world of at least one person. That's a lot more difficult to discard. If you come and tell me you have within you the ability to change the world of somebody around you, doesn't even have to be in the foster care and adoption space. Might be your neighbor, might be a family member, might be somebody at work. You do. You have that opportunity. You have an incredible gift that God has given you, or this business that God has given you, or this wad of money that God has given you where you can help fund adoptions. Like, I want you to see this in yourself and make it relatable and tangible for them. It's a lot more difficult to discard that, right? So we shrink the problem. Number 2, we grow our people. So we make the problem feel a little bit smaller, and we make our people feel a little bit bigger. We flip the script because they've got it upside down. They see the big problem, and they feel real small. What we want to do is make the problem smaller and them feel bigger. We're going to talk about this more in detail, but just to reiterate, it's discipleship. And we're going to talk at the end about discipleship. So we shrink the problem, we grow our people, and then finally, we chart the path. How are we on time? Great. After this, we're going to take a short break. Sound good? Chart the path. We shrink the problem, empower and grow our people, and then we set a path moving forward with clarity so they know exactly what the next steps are for them. We talked about this a little bit in the beginning. Our 2 primary paths of ministry are front-end motivation. How are we discipling more people into this? Empowering them with the uniqueness and the creativity that God's given them, finding their space. And then on the back end, how are we supporting them through this? So let's talk about that a little bit. There's a couple of different paths that can be taken in your church. Some of you are in a position where you are working from a top-down path, that you have the opportunity and the voice and the platform to work top-down from the platform. You can engage the whole crowd. A hypothetical path for you could be, again, there's no prescription, there's no rule, there's no magic bullet, but one thing that you can consider is beginning to engage the whole crowd with really good, compelling, tangible, relatable messaging, empowering them with an everyone can do something message, and then building a bridge for them to step into as a next step. So it can look something like this. We're going to cast a blanket out over all of our people, a blanket of the gospel, a blanket of everyone can do something, a blanket of a tangible, relatable message that you, in the unique creativity that God has designed you, has the capacity to change the world of people around you. Now, here's the next step. We have an informational meeting in 2 weeks, and we want you to sign up and come to learn more. So we cast the net out over our entire church, a net that no one can escape out from underneath. Even the Joe Smith blue-collar guy, my wife dragged me to church this morning after 3 weeks of convincing her I didn't need to go. That guy too. And then we start to draw that net back in, and we see who God catches up. And we build a bridge event. A bridge event meaning most people are not going to go from anonymous in a worship service to foster care training. Like, that's a huge leap, right? So we build a bridge for them to help them process, help them connect, and that bridge is important. A luncheon, an informational meeting, some kind of a social gathering, and then maybe from there you're identifying more specific next steps. Hey, what are y'all thinking? What are you feeling? Well, we're thinking that we want to learn more about foster care. Great. We're going to start a class or a group where they begin to explore some of the unique things about foster care. We want to pursue adoption. Great. We want to connect you with people that have walked that road and are currently walking that road so that you can be in community with them. And then we're going to identify next steps. And this can be a cycle for you. So going back to the, Orphan Sunday is good, but we don't just want it to be like this one-time big shot deal, okay? Great. So when we do those big deals, we always do them as a starting point of a much longer path. That we don't just do Orphan Sunday in isolation. It actually, in some cases, with the exception, in many cases, it maybe is a little more counterproductive if we do it just in isolation. We rile our people up, we get them excited, and then we give them no path. No path. So let's do those big events if we have the capacity and the platform, and we'll talk about those who don't yet. And then let's build a bridge. And then maybe let's use this, let's be cyclical in this. Maybe we do this once a semester in our church. Maybe eventually we start doing it once a quarter. And now we've got this annual rhythm where we are engaging the crowd in some capacity. Engaging the crowd doesn't have to be a full-on sermon. It can be, though, something that is whatever the communication portals are in your church that everyone in your church is communicated to, you can count that as an engaging the crowd. Everyone in our church is having this net thrown out, and then we're going to start slowly pulling it in. And then next quarter, we're going to do it again. And then next quarter, we're going to do it again. Maybe the goal for you in your church is, let's just try that once this year and see what happens. Let me encourage you with this. This is really cool. This is creating smaller circles. This is the build a bridge section here. That we cast this net out. The larger circle represents our whole church. Some of them have little isolated fires in them. This is my charismatic slide with the fires in people's hearts. Because here's the deal, is that there's people in your church that have this private fire in their heart for this, but they haven't made it public yet. They're privately considering it. And what we do when we cast the net out wide and then we start drawing it in is we dangle a carrot out in front of them. And we say, hey, if that's you, bite on this carrot and come to this luncheon. We're dangling carrots out in front of people. And what's really cool, I see it all the time all over the place, is when we build this bridge event, we create this smaller circle, and we bring them into a room, and we bring these isolated individual fires together collectively to begin to burn together. It's really, really, really cool. And a couple of things happen. Number one, churches are surprised by the number of people that show up, and they're surprised by the types of people that show up. Like you're standing in the back of the room, they're walking in, you're going, whoa, you really? All right, okay. All right, here we go. And stories start to emerge that are really, really cool in your church. I've been in bridge events like this at churches. After a Sunday service, they bring in lunch, rooms this size. Go around the room and share. I've seen older people stand up and say, way back in the 60s and 70s, before this was really even a thing, we started fostering. We've fostered 100 kids over the years. And blah, 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 blah. And everyone in the room is shocked, right? Wow, I walk by you every Sunday because you're a greeter at the door and you pass out bulletins. I never knew that part of your story. And now they do. How cool is that? It pulls people out of the woodworks. So a top-down is we're throwing the blanket out and we're pulling it in. 4 things to do at a bridge event. Share stories like that. Helps build connection and engagement. Introduce leadership. Show people in your church, this is who you go to and who you talk with if you need anything. Because here's the deal, if people don't know where to go or who to talk to, guess what? They're not going to go anywhere or talk to anybody. And that rule is across the board. If I have marriage struggles and I don't know where to go in my church to talk to somebody about it, I'm not going to go to anybody in my church and talk to anybody about it. So let's provide clarity. This is who you go to. This is who you talk with about this ministry. Introduce leadership, cast vision. We're brokering hope for our people. This is us moving forward. We can't do everything now. We want to be very smart. We want to be very strategic, and we want to serve you. And then define next steps. Here's the next step after this luncheon. Here's the tangible next thing for you to do. We're not going to leave you on your own. Now, let's flip that. Bottom up, where probably most of you are. Bottom up ministry. We don't have the platform. We don't have this Orphan Sunday. We don't have the top down of our leadership. Great. You are not without hope. You've got so much that you can do. You're starting bottom up. You're going to start building community before you actually start building ministry. Focus first on building a healthy community, then second on starting a new ministry. For you, you're starting with community, and that's actually a positive. When you're working top down, it's sometimes really hard in a larger system to build strong community among people. To try to get them all dispersed together is hard. But when you're starting here, it's really, really powerful. And it creates a framework and a foundation from which things can grow in a really healthy way. So maybe for you, the question is not so much, how do we start a ministry? But the question for you is, how do we start building community? How do we start building community among people in our church that are already involved in this or have expressed some interest in this? Does that make sense? A story that I love, I don't know if it's true, but I tell it as if it is, okay? The urban legend is that way back in the day when they were building the University of California, Irvine, building or expanding it, I'm not sure how the lie goes, but either way, the principle applies. The architect came in and they designed the site plan and they built the buildings, but they did not install the sidewalks. They built the buildings, no sidewalks, and they were testing the rule of the path of least resistance, which says people are going to choose the shortest path from point A to point B. No matter how you tell them to go or which direction you tell them to walk, over time people will eventually start to choose their own path. So we've all seen it. We've been at a park or somewhere in a public space and there's a sidewalk that goes around the field, but now there's also a trail that people have cut across the field, right? The path of least resistance. So we're going to build the buildings, no sidewalks. We're going to let the students, over the course of several months, tell us what path they want to walk from building to building. So they spent about 6 months letting students carve out the paths. Then, afterwards, they went back and they laid the foundation on those paths. They didn't tell the students where to walk in the beginning. They wanted to identify where are the students going to naturally walk, and let's begin to lay some foundation there. Make sense? So, if you are starting in a position where it is bottom up, and the first step for you is not to start a ministry, but it's simply to build community, the best thing that you can do is figure out where your people are already walking and begin to lay some foundation there. Begin to lay some foundation there. It's a lot of shoulder tapping. You know, hey, we know you're a foster family. We know you're an adoptive family. We're going to start getting together. And you know what they're going to say? Thank God finally, right? Okay? Because they're probably already frustrated that your church isn't doing that. They're going to be so grateful. And it doesn't have to be big. We're just going to do a backyard barbecue. Or maybe it's an informational meeting at church. Maybe you'll get that space and that permission from church. But do whatever you can to just start getting them in a room together, sharing stories with each other, learning where each other is walking, and start to lay some foundation there. What happens when we build community is ministry inevitably happens from that. We start serving each other and meeting each other's needs. So begin by building community, because people are always more important than processes, always. And make sure you're setting up processes that serve people. And that's what that UC Irvine story tells me, is that figuring out where people are going to naturally walk is more important than us telling them where they need to walk, okay? So let's figure out where they're walking, and then let's figure out how we can set up processes that serve them. This is the art of building community. Here's what it could look like for you, very nuts and bolts tangible. If you are starting super ground level grassroots and we want to start building community, work in concentric circles. Your first circle is the already involved, and you probably already know who they are. Who are the foster and adoptive families in our church? Maybe you don't know all of them. Maybe you can work with your church leadership on, hey, we're not asking for a sermon. We're not asking for an Orphan Sunday. All we're asking is for some way to begin to identify who in our church is in this space, is fostering and adopting. And they'll likely look at you and say, all right, we can try to figure that out. And then begin to get them in a room together. If it's your own backyard for a barbecue or a luncheon at church with free childcare, whatever it might be, start with that first concentric circle. Spend time together, weeks, maybe even months together, getting to know each other and encouraging and supporting each other. And then at some point, you'll start to reach outside that. Most of those people have had someone, she disappeared, but most of you, if you're in the trenches, have had someone come up and say, you're awesome. You're awesome. I've thought about doing that one day, but gosh, you're awesome. I don't know if I could ever do it, but God, my husband and I have thought about that. We've been praying about that. We've always said we want to do that one day. Most of us have one or two of those people in our life. That's our next concentric circle. We've spent time together as those that are already involved. And now we say, all right, let's move to the next circle and start inviting in those that have expressed interest. And we just begin to expand the circles around us. And now what we've got is we're slowly beginning to build this two-path ministry. Number one, we've got people already involved, and we're figuring out ways to support them. And now we're beginning to invite new people into this, and we're figuring out ways to disciple them further. Does it make sense? So look, if you're in a position where you don't have the support of your leadership and you don't have the platform, I want you to know that you are not without hope, and there is so much incredible work that you can do. It is grassroots, in the trenches. You're going to get dirty. It's going to feel hard. But man, it's going to be so, so, so good. I have been in places where they had the top-down support, but the top butchered it. So don't think that if we can just get him to announce it from stage or preach a sermon, it will solve all of our problems. I've been in rooms where they got him to preach the sermon, and it was awful. Awful. Did more harm than help. Or they got him to make the announcement, but he was handed a card on his way out on the stage, has no idea how to message this. We've spent months trying to reinforce an everyone can do something message. We've got a luncheon planned in 2 weeks for everybody in the church to get involved. And he gets up there and says, how great is that? Isn't that wonderful? God's adopted us all. And so if you feel called to adopt, we really encourage you to go to this lunch. That's not the message we want. And you just told the entire church that that's it, okay? You butchered it. So don't think that if we can just get that, it'll solve all of our problems. Sometimes it actually creates more problems. So you're in a great position. A few things to consider as you approach church leadership. Number one, establish proof of concept. Remember the 80-20 rule? We want to raise 100,000. We need 80, but we've already got 20. There's proof of concept. It's working without you. That's a powerful message to a pastor. If you communicate it in the right way, right? That can be very bad. It's working even without you, jerk, right? Or, hey, we're not asking you to run a new ministry. We're not asking to put more on your plate. God is already doing some really cool things without you. It's meeting the needs of people in our church. That's ultimately the heart of a pastor. Are the things that we're doing meeting the needs of the people in our church? Present a strategic plan. Look, if you're a foster mom, the absolute worst time to go and convince your pastor that you need this ministry is, like the day after a kid that's been in your home for 2 years has been removed and you screamed at the caseworker that morning on the phone, and now you're going to go have an emotionally hot meeting with your pastor, right? We should be doing this. This is important. Wrong time, okay? What we don't want to do is come in emotionally hot. We want to come in strategic with a plan. This is what it's going to look like, reasonable, actionable plan for the ministry and how it can be most effectively executed. Keep the larger picture in mind. As a pastor, I always appreciate it if somebody came in and said, here's what we feel like we want to do, because here's how it fits into the larger vision of our church. And we're not so naive to think that we're the only thing happening in this church. We understand all the moving parts, not near to the degree that you do, but we understand it's more than just us. So we want to make sure that what we do fits into the larger ministry and culture of our church. And then maybe you need to flip your assumptions. A lot of times we assume our church isn't on board and my pastor isn't on board because he doesn't care or she doesn't care or they don't care. And so maybe our assumptions are a little off. What if we assumed it's not that they don't care, they do care, they just don't know how to care? And now it's my job to help them know how to care. I remove the burden from them to start caring, and I place the burden on me to start showing them and educating them on how to care. So flip our assumptions maybe. When your leadership isn't on board, here's a few things I want to encourage you in. Be prayerful. Pray for a movement. Don't push an agenda. Number 2, be faithful. Use your actions and not just your words. Continue to show them what this looks like in your family, in your life, in the lives of people in your church. Show them the benefits. Use your actions. Be humble. The worst way to try to implement something good in your church is to point out all the bad that's going on to your leadership, right? Here's how we're so wrong and so bad, and that's why we should do this good thing. Yeah, not Aaron. Aaron loves that at his church, but most other people don't like that at their church. Just doesn't really work. So be humble. Say, here's all the really cool, here's the thing that we love about our church and what our church is doing and what God's doing in our church, and here's how this really beautifully fits right into the stream of what God is doing. Be helpful. Don't use information as ammunition. Gosh, Pastor, I mean, don't you know that there's 1,000 kids in our city that need foster homes? Don't use it as ammunition, use it as encouragement. Feed him books, feed her books, introduce her to bring her to places like this. There's a pastor here because a guy named Nathan probably bugged the heck out of him, Not that he wouldn't have come on his own, but, hey, I'd just love for you to be there, right? Just to encourage you and just to be in the room with other people, Expose them to things, be an encouragement, and then be patient. Don't expect things to change overnight. So this ministry is worth the hard work that it takes with the long view in mind. We believe it's worth it. And so we know that things won't change overnight. They don't change overnight in the lives of the kids and families we serve. Remember, this is a human thing. These are real life humans. And it might not change overnight in our church. And so be patient. One more slide, and then we're going to take a break and then have Olive Crest come and reintroduce us back. Okay? So bear with me. It's kind of a heavy slide too. So in the spirit of talking about special and normal, we've talked about paths, setting paths, and we've talked about kind of wanting to stay away from the special event mentality. And so what does that look like very practically in our churches? Let's look at it this way. Kind of hard to see, but bear with me. What we want to talk about is developing a drip strategy for your church. And here's what that means. The difference between a fire hydrant and a drip. What we're doing today is a fire hydrant. And what we want to do in our churches is a more consistent drip. Fire hydrants in our church, just a lot of information all at once. It's just a lot to take in. Can be things like a sermon or a foster care awareness emphasis or a back to school drive or an orphan Sunday. Whole church, church-wide, everybody's hearing it, big fire hydrant, we're dumping it all out. But what we want to do is underneath these fire hydrant moments in our church is first off, we want to try to evenly and strategically place them throughout the year. Maybe right now, the best thing for you is we're going to do one fire hydrant. That's the best that we can do right now. Great. Over time, what we want to do is find some space between them so we're not constantly fire hydranting our people, okay? That we're creating space between them. And then underneath that, we are Chinese water torturing our people, right? Just dripping on their forehead until they finally succumb to it, right? We're dripping this message on our people. I think it's counterproductive for it to always be a big deal. Sometimes it just needs to be a small thing that's still significant. It doesn't always need to be Orphan Sunday. It doesn't always need to be a sermon. It doesn't always need to be a big event. Sometimes a drip can just be a very subtle and simple sermon illustration, which are super easy to come by in Scripture. It's really hard not to read extended passages of Scripture and not come by this idea that God sees hard places and broken people and steps towards them, or that God is our Father and we are His children. Like, it's just all over the place. Got to do more gymnastics to not use the illustration than you do to figure out how to use it. So maybe it's just an illustration. Maybe it's a story. We're just sharing a story. And that's it. And it's a diversity of stories. Maybe we're just offering a gathering. Hey, if you're a foster and adoptive family in our church, we love you, we value you. Next week there's a barbecue in so-and-so's backyard, and they're out in the back, and you can talk to them. We just want you to be connected. That's it. Not a whole sermon. Okay? We're just dripping on our people. Maybe it's a parent-child dedication. One thing that we would do at our church plant was We had a bunch of families, so we did a lot of child dedications all the time. But we started to incorporate foster and adoptive families into it. And so what that looked like was on any given Sunday, you could show up, and it might not be planned, like this is Child Dedication Sunday, but we might take 2 or 3 minutes and say, hey, Joe and Sue, you guys come up on stage. As many of you know, we've got a lot of people in our church that are engaged in foster care and adoption. Joe and Sue just finished, they signed their license, finished all their training, and their home is now available. And so as a church, we are going to stand and pray over them and dedicate ourselves to them and commit to them that as they bring kids into their home, that we're going to be there for them, that we got your back. We pray, Joe and Sue are gone, 2 to 3 minutes, done, okay? But the power in that moment cannot be overstated. Joe and Sue feel overwhelmingly supported and loved. We just dripped on our church. Hey, don't forget, this is what we're about. And then we move on, okay? So we're dripping on our people as much as we can. Be creative. Be creative. How can we drip on our people? One of the best things that you can do as a leadership is sit down and say, let's to the best of our ability, develop out a 12-month drip strategy. And let's set some goals. And gosh, we would love to do this. And it begins to give you a framework that you can start pursuing and operating within. And you can amend it as you go. But it's also helpful to present this to your church leadership. To say, look, we don't need a sermon every Sunday, or we're not always asking for big things. Sometimes the smallest things can be the most significant things. But this creates a sense of normalcy. If somebody comes to your church for any extended period of time, the goal would be to say, hey, is it normal for you to hear about foster care and adoption opportunities in our church? And your hope would be that they say, yeah, actually I do hear about that a lot at your church. Great, success. It's become normalized part of our language and culture. Not always a big deal, not always a secret hidden deal, but an interplay between the two. And it begins to build out a normalized culture. Let's take a break. Before we do that, if there's any burning questions or thoughts, would love to field those. Otherwise, we're going to take a short break, and then you're going to come back and hear from one of our sponsors, and then we'll continue on through lunch. Any burning questions right now? If I don't ask it, I just won't make it to the bathroom. I will just fall over and die from anticipation. Yes, right there.
I'm curious. We have a we're considered a small, big church.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Nope.
Okay.
In Texas, it's small or big. Like 100 or 10,000.
Well, we're about, I want to say, our church has gone through some transition.
Gotcha.
And we've been the only foster family, honestly, maybe ever. Because
Yeah.
that's just, we're pretty vocal about who we are and what we do. I'm also not perfect to go and telling everyone that they should or have to.
Right.
But I'm also concerned that, so how would you suggest bringing some of these strategies in? Because, so we don't have, if I go in, I'm like, yeah, we need to support these foster families. That's me. Come,
Right.
God, come and pray for us and take my kids places and babysit.
Yeah.
It's a little awkward.
Yep.
So, and maybe not appropriate.
It is.
But I believe it, and I believe that and a lot of our churches in our area are starting to have these ministries, and I'm really excited about it. And then I'm wondering, well, why isn't our church getting involved?
Right.
Why isn't our church,
Yes.
I love our church, but
I get it.
how would you?
I get it. I think most other people in the room get it. We hear where you are. So a couple things. A lot of times, so I was the pastor of our church and a foster family. We got no support, nothing. Part of it by nature being the pastor, it's a little isolating, but also sometimes you kind of got to be not the martyr, like, oh, woe is me, but like, we might not get all of it, but if we can help build it out and give it for other people, there's something to that. Second is doing what you're doing, tapping into the larger community that's going on around you and pulling people from your church into supporting them so it doesn't feel so self-serving. But also there's something to be said for as we prepare our people for this, in whatever space they're getting involved, foster care, adoption, global orphan, whatever, it is weird to ask for help. And here's the deal, is we know all the ways that you can support us. But we got ourselves into this. And so I'm not going to ask you, did you know that you can babysit and bring meals? By the way, what are you doing Saturday, right? It seems awkward. So here's the deal. we need to remove that awkward burden from our families and place it on the church. I want churches to be training people, to be educating people in the church on how they can support foster families. That's the ideal. But second, we also need to prepare our people for the expectation that you not only do you need help, but as much as we can, are requiring that you ask for it. Because when you don't ask for it, you lose and the people around you lose. Every time you don't ask someone for help, you deprive someone of their something. And I don't mean that in a guilt way. I just mean it in a, so we now have lots of meals brought to our house, like way too many casseroles. And it got so bad that I had to actually develop a one-page resource for our church that taught people how to bring meals because it was awful. They would sign up months in advance, and then we wouldn't hear from them. It'd be 5:30 that night, and we're not sure if they're still coming, okay? So rule number 1, notify the family a couple days before. I remember you, it's happening. Number 2, they would finally show up, and it would be disgusting. Like our kids wouldn't eat it, and now we're scrambling because we were banking on that meal. You never asked us what we liked, and now you brought like beef casserole, and my kids are vomiting, and now it's made things worse for me. I've got to figure out what we're going to do. So let them know you're coming, ask them what they like, and be on time. And number 4, don't stay. Don't walk in, don't talk, just hand it to them. I love you, you're awesome. I'm going to stay out of your way because I know it's dinner time. So we developed a sheet. So that's all, has nothing to do with what we're talking about, except for the fact, now here's what it does. My wife feels real guilty for how many meals people bring us. And I say, no. We have to let them continue to do it to a certain degree because this is their something. They're feeling like they're contributing. We've got to set that expectation up for our people. We are almost going to require that you ask for help, but we're going to help you do that because we're going to help educate people around you in our church on how they can do that. Okay? So it's going to feel a little awkward, but we're going to be there with you, and it's going to be okay.